Elena's kitchen always had a cozy atmosphere. This evening, as the sun slowly dipped below the horizon and her favorite apple pie stood on the table, she busied herself with preparing dinner. The air was filled with the aromas of spices mingling with the smell of baking. She had almost finished chopping the vegetables when she heard a slight rustle behind her. Elena froze, straining to listen. The noise was coming from the back door, which she rarely used. Turning around, the woman saw a small figure rush toward the door, clutching something tightly in its hands. Elena had time to see the thin face of a boy about 8 years old, with large, frightened eyes. Her heart squeezed with surprise and pity at the same time. He grabbed the bag of buns that was on the table and rushed toward the yard. "Hey!" she exclaimed, but not angrily, but rather surprised. The boy did not turn around, his figure flashed out of the door, disappearing into the shadows of the evening garden. Helena quickly put down her knife and rushed after him, not knowing whether it was curiosity or sudden concern that drove her. She crossed the courtyard and saw the boy run across the road and turn into the alley between the houses. Elena followed him, trying to keep her distance so as not to scare him off. The path led to an old, dilapidated building that had once served as a warehouse but now stood abandoned and gloomy. She approached the building and peered inside through a cracked window. The picture she saw made her heart sink. A boy was kneeling in front of a girl about 5 years old, thin and sickly pale. He untied the package and carefully handed her the bun. The girl took it greedily, but did not eat it immediately. She looked at the boy, and in that look she saw both gratitude and suffering. Elena was about to move away, so as not to disturb the children, when she noticed on the boy's neck traces of dark spots, bruises. They looked as if someone had grabbed him roughly by the neck. A wave of concern and compassion swept over her at what she saw. Who are they, these children? Where are their parents and why are they living in such a state? Elena stepped away from the window and, struggling to hold back the coming tears, thought, I can't just walk away and forget about this. Elena stood behind the wall, leaning against the cold brick, and tried to gather her thoughts. Her mind was whirling. What to do next, how to help the children without frightening them or making the situation worse. Realizing that the sudden intrusion might frighten them, she decided to observe first and see if there was anyone else around to keep an eye on them. The boy, meanwhile, smiled encouragingly at the girl and wiped her skinny hands with an old, worn handkerchief. He looked exhausted and tired, but his eyes shone with care and tenderness. The girl, sitting obediently on the old, dusty mat, began to eat the bun in small pieces, as if trying to stretch this rare pleasure. Elena decided to proceed cautiously. She knocked on the wooden door leading into the dilapidated room and called out softly. "Hi, I don't want to hurt you. It's okay, I just wanted to make sure you were okay." The inside was immediately alert. The boy jumped up, shielding his sister, his eyes filled with fear and defensiveness as he stared at the door. "Please don't be afraid," Elena added, trying to keep her voice as soft and warm as possible. "I saw you come to get food. You're hungry, aren't you? Let me help you." There was a tense pause. The boy slowly stepped forward, not taking his wary gaze off Elena. The girl, feeling her brother's tension, froze and only clutched the remains of the bun more tightly. "Who are you?" quietly but firmly asked him. In the voice was heard fear, mixed with childish curiosity. "My name is Elena. I live nearby," the woman explained. "I saw you and realized you needed help. Don't be afraid, I just want to help." The boy did not answer at once, his gaze wandered to his sister, who was looking at him again with concern. After a moment, still not lowering his wariness, he nodded. We don't have a home," he whispered. "We're here because, we don't have anyone else." Elena felt her heart clench. She moved closer and crouched down so she was at the boy's eye level. "It's okay, I'm here to help," she said with firmness. "But we need to talk more. Can I help you get out of here? I have food and warm blankets at home." The boy hesitated, but seeing the tiredness and trust in Helena's eyes, he looked at his sister again and sighed. "Okay," he finally said, barely holding back tears. Elena couldn't sleep all night after seeing the children in the abandoned house. Thoughts of them, of their hungry eyes and the bruises on the boy's body kept her awake. She decided that she would be sure to return the next morning with food and try to learn more about their story so she could figure out how to help. At dawn, she gathered a basket of food, bread, cheese, fruit, some hot soup in a thermos, and set off toward the abandoned building. The sun was just beginning to rise above the rooftops, coloring the city in golden and pink tones. Elena stopped at a familiar door and knocked softly. Muffled footsteps sounded inside. After a moment, the door opened and Elena met her gaze with a boy who stood holding a stick at the ready. When he saw her, he slowly lowered the improvised weapon, but the wariness in his eyes remained. "I brought you breakfast," she said, showing the basket. "May I come in?" The boy hesitated, glancing back at his sister, who sat in the corner watching them intently. Then, with a sigh, he opened the door slightly, allowing Elena to enter. She stepped carefully across the threshold and set the basket on the half-ruined table. "What's your name?" she asked softly, taking a seat next to him and handing the bread to the girl. "I'm Mark, and this is my sister Sophie," the boy answered, watching her every move carefully. Sophie didn't move, continuing to stare at the woman, but when Mark nodded to her, she took the piece of bread carefully and held it to her chest, as if she was afraid it might be taken away. "Do you live here?" Elena asked, knowing the question might be too personal, but hoping the boy would want to confide in her. Mark lowered his gaze and nervously rubbed the hem of his old jacket. "Yeah, for a few weeks now," he said quietly. "We were living with my parents, but then there was a fire." Elena froze, feeling the cold creeping into her heart. She didn't dare interrupt, giving the boy time to continue. "Our house caught fire in the night," Mark's voice trembled, and he struggled to hold back tears. "Dad yelled for us to run out, and Mom, she stayed. We ran outside, but then Dad came back for her. We never saw them again." He clenched his fists, holding back sobs. Sophie looked at her brother with her big, frightened eyes and frowned too. "They told us they were gone," Mark whispered. "We were at the neighbors, but then, they didn't want to keep us. We tried to find help, but they wouldn't take us to shelters." Elena realized that the children were in a desperate situation. She felt tears coming to her eyes, but she held herself back, trying to look calm and confident. "I'm so sorry you had to go through that," she said. "But you're not alone now. I'll help you." Mark looked at her in disbelief, but there was a spark of hope in his eyes. Elena tried not to show her excitement, but she was torn with compassion for these children. Their story was much harder than she could have imagined. She understood that the boys' trust had to be earned, but she couldn't leave them alone with their trouble. "Mark," she said, leaning closer so as not to startle him, "I have friends who can help. But to do that, I need to know more. Are you here all alone?" The boy nodded, crossing his arms over his chest. Sophie stopped eating and rested her head on his shoulder. She obviously only felt safe around her brother. "It's been just the two of us here since we left the last neighbors," Mark answered after a pause. "They were nice to us at first, but then they said they had enough problems of their own and kicked us out." Elena felt anger and powerlessness. How could they kick out children without parents? She tried to refrain from saying anything harsh, knowing that the most important thing now was to make them feel safe. "It won't happen again," she promised. "I'll make sure you're not alone." Mark kept his eyes on her. They were a mixture of mistrust and hope, as if he was afraid to believe that anyone could really help. "Why do you want to help us?" he finally asked, clenching his fist. "We were told that no one would care about people like us." Elena leaned closer and looked into his eyes. "Because you deserve better," she said softly. "Because no one should be left alone, especially strong and brave children like you." Mark blinked, as if trying to hold back tears, and turned away, as if embarrassed by his emotions. Sophie, sensing the tension, squeezed his hand lightly. Elena realized that the moment was right to make the next move. She stood up and turned to the children. Please give me a chance to prove that you are no longer alone. I have a place where you can eat, rest, and not be afraid every night. What do you say?" Mark hesitated. He looked at his sister, who had already fallen asleep, weary from worry and hunger. At that moment his defenses broke down and he nodded. "Okay, but if anything goes wrong, we'll leave." Elena smiled and felt a wave of relief run through her body. "I promise you'll be safe," she said, hiding the tremor in her voice. Helena carefully helped Mark wrap Sophie in the old plaid that served as her blanket. The girl hardly woke up, only sighed softly when she was lifted from the floor. Mark held his sister tightly, fearing that she might be picked up or fall. Seeing the care with which the boy treated his sister, Elena felt a sharp pain in her heart again. So much responsibility for such a small child. They cautiously stepped out of the abandoned building. The streets were still deserted, and the morning chill could be felt in the air. Elena led the children toward her house, looking around carefully to make sure no one was following them. "This way," she said as she opened the gate. Her house was small but cozy, with a well-kept garden and warm, light curtains on the windows. Mark looked around warily as they stepped inside. "You'll be safe here," Helena said, showing them to the living room. "You can make yourself at home." Mark nodded silently, still holding his sister in his arms. Elena led them over to the couch and helped lay Sophie down. The girl slept so soundly that she didn't even open her eyes when she was covered with a warm blanket. "Do you want something to eat?" Elena asked, turning to Mark. He nodded cautiously, watching her movements. The woman quickly heated the soup and placed the bread on a plate. While he ate, Elena sat across from him and didn't rush him with conversation, giving him time to get used to the new place and the feeling of safety. The boy ate slowly, as if he was afraid the food would run out. With each spoonful, his tension eased a little and his gaze became less wary. "Thank you," he murmured, putting down his spoon and meeting Elena's gaze. "We haven't eaten properly in days." "I'm glad I could help," she replied, smiling. "Here you will always have food and a place to sleep." Mark looked at her for a long moment, then sighed softly and spoke. "When the fire happened, I heard Daddy scream. He picked us up and we ran out of the house. But Mom stayed behind, she was trying to save something important. We waited for them outside, but then the house burst into flames, and—" His voice shook, his eyes filled with tears. "Then the neighbors took us in, but they said they couldn't keep us. We moved from place to place until we ended up here." Elena listened, feeling bitterness rise to her throat. She didn't know what to say except to hug him. But she understood, it would take time for the boy to believe in her and open his soul completely. It had been a few days since Elena had taken Mark and Sophie into her home. The children were slowly getting used to their new surroundings, and although Mark was still wary, he was beginning to trust Elena. Children's voices were heard in the house again, and Helena felt the emptiness she had long felt in her soul begin to fill with warmth. One evening, when the children were asleep, Elena sat in the kitchen with a cup of tea, thinking about what to do next. She was bothered by Mark's story, especially the part about the fire and how their parents had supposedly died. Something about the story seemed odd to her, as if some details had been left out or hidden. She decided that she would go to the local police department the next day and find out more about what had happened. The next morning, Elena went to the police station. She didn't have the children's papers on hand, but she hoped she could get some clues. The receptionist, a middle-aged man with a tired face, listened to her story and agreed to help, advising her to consult the archives. "The fire at the house on Rose Street was a pretty big one," he said, flipping through an old logbook. "Let me see, yeah, here it is. The records confirm that 2 adults died and 2 children were reported missing." Elena felt her heart sink. "Missing?" she asked again. So no one had officially confirmed their deaths? The policeman shook his head. "That's right. It was hard to identify anything in the house. The fire had destroyed almost everything. The children were listed as missing because they were not found among the survivors and eyewitnesses." Elena frowned, looking at the records. Was there any trace of what might have happened to their father afterward? Maybe someone had seen him? The man scratched his chin, pondering. The father was a businessman. His name had been mentioned several times in the context of financial problems and debts. Some neighbors claimed to have seen him after the fire, but there was no proof. He seemed to have simply disappeared. Elena nodded gratefully, thanked the policeman and headed home, mulling over what she had heard. If the children's father could have survived, why hadn't he come for them? On the way home, Elena couldn't escape the thought that Mark and Sophie's father might have been alive. Why had he disappeared and not come back for his children? There were too many questions that had no answers. She felt that this story was far more complicated than it seemed at first glance. Late at night, when the children were asleep, Elena sat by the window and thought about everything she had learned at the police station. The silence of the night was interrupted by a quiet rustle outside the window. Elena was alert, her heart quickened its pace. She stood up and cautiously approached the window. In the darkness of the courtyard she saw the figure of a man. He stood motionless, looking toward the house. Elena's heart sank. The man looked gaunt, with an unshaven face and old clothes, but there was something familiar in his posture and demeanor. She pulled back the curtain to get a better look at him, and for a moment their eyes met. The man hurriedly turned away and disappeared into the shadows before Helena could do anything about it. She backed away from the window, feeling a chill run through her body. Who was that? Why was he watching the house? The thought flashed through her mind, could it be the children's father? But if that was the case, why was he hiding? Elena knew she couldn't wait quietly for the situation to clear up on its own. The next morning, when Mark and Sophie were having breakfast, she decided to ask questions cautiously, without scaring them off. "Mark," she began, taking a seat at the table, "do you remember what your dad looked like? Did he often wear any special things that you remember?" Mark frowned, clearly surprised by the question. He set the spoon aside and thought for a moment. "Yes," he said quietly. "Dad had a watch with a leather strap and a gold clasp. He always said it was a family heirloom, passed down from his grandfather." "Why do you ask?" Elena smiled, trying to look casual. "Just curious," she replied. "I thought I might have seen a similar watch on someone in town." Mark looked at her, but didn't say anything. A shadow of hope flickered in his eyes, which he immediately tried to hide. After breakfast, Elena went to the police again to check another detail. She told them about the night incident and that she had seen a man outside her house. The officer she told about it frowned slightly and asked her to wait. A few minutes later he returned with a folder. "We have some information," he said, opening it. "A couple of months ago, a neighbor reported seeing a man similar to your description near where the Rose family home once stood. But we have no further information." Elena walked home from the police station, mentally going over the information she had heard. The image of the man at her house and the policeman's words about his possible appearance after the fire kept her on her toes. She realized there was more than just an accident behind it all. She needed to talk to those who had lived nearby that unfortunate day. As she walked down the street where Mark and Sophie's house had once stood, she saw an old woman sitting on the porch of one of the neighboring houses. Elena recognized her, Mrs. Hart, who had lived here for years and seemed to know everyone. Elena decided this was a chance to learn something new. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Hart," she said affably as she came closer. "May I ask you a couple of questions? It's about the fire that happened a few months ago." Mrs. Hart looked at Helena over her glasses with interest and nodded. "Of course, dear, though it's best not to think of that day. So much horror and tragedy. What exactly are you interested in?" Elena sighed and sat down next to her, explaining the situation, telling her about the children in her attempt to help them. Mrs. Hart's eyes widened in surprise, and she gave a short snicker. "You know, I thought none of the kids survived that fire. But one day, shortly after the tragedy, I saw something strange. A woman who looked like their mother, Margaret, was here on the street. She looked scared and kept looking around. I tried to call out to her, but she disappeared as soon as she spotted me." Elena froze, feeling a chill run down her spine. So the mother might have survived? But why didn't she come back for the children? She asked, trying to comprehend what she had heard. Mrs. Hart shrugged and tilted her head to the side. I don't know, dear. But there was a rumor that night that Mark, their father, was in debt up to his eyeballs. He'd been seen with some suspicious people. They said he'd gotten into some shady business to save his business. The woman's words hung in the air, and Elena realized that the truth of the tragedy could have been much more complicated. Elena sat next to Mrs. Hart, trying to make sense of what she had heard. If Margaret, Mark and Sophie's mother, had indeed survived the fire, why had she disappeared and not returned for her children? Why was she in hiding? And if Mark, the father, was involved in some criminal endeavor, what was his role in the story? The questions multiplied and the answers were still too vague. Do you have any idea who their father might have been in contact with? Elena asked, trying to find some clue. Oh, darling, it's not that simple. They said he was connected with some investors. Mrs. Hart stressed the word, indicating its double meaning. But they sounded more like debt collectors than business partners. Elena nodded. It was all beginning to build up into a bizarre picture, with one detail clinging to another, forming something much more than just an accident. Mrs. Hart, noticing the pensive expression on Helena's face, leaned slightly toward her. My dear, I know you can't rely on chance alone in these matters. If you really want to get to the bottom of this, you should talk to Tom Langley. He's an ex-fireman and he was on duty that night. He knew something, I'm sure, but he kept quiet, she whispered, as if afraid someone would overhear their conversation. Helena thanked Mrs. Hart and headed home, thinking of a new plan of action. She decided that tomorrow she would try to find this Tom Langley. If he could shed some light on the events of that night, it might be possible to find out why Margaret had disappeared and what had really happened to Mark. The next day Helena went to a small cafe on the outskirts of town where she had heard Tom Langley spent his mornings with a cup of coffee. The cafe was cozy, with the smell of fresh baked goods and the warmth of sunlight streaming through the large windows. She looked around the room and noticed a man with gray hair and a tired face sitting by the window. Tom Langley? Elena approached him cautiously, stepping closer. The man looked up and studied her. Yes, that's me. What can I do for you? He asked, a little wary. Elena introduced herself and told him about the children, their history, and that she was trying to find out the truth about the fire and the family that had been affected. Tom tensed slightly and shook his head. It was a terrible business, he began, glancing out the window. The fire broke out suddenly, too quickly, as if someone had accelerated its spread on purpose. But there was no evidence, so we wrote it off as an accident. However, there was something strange. Elena held her breath, listening to every word. I saw a woman running out of the house, Tom continued, frowning his forehead. She was in her nightgown, with burned hands, but she disappeared into the crowd, and no one could find her after that. At the time I thought I was just imagining it because of the stress, but now, hearing your story, I'm starting to believe it was Margaret. Elena felt her heart pound harder. If Tom had seen Margaret that night, then the possibility that she had survived was real. But why was she hiding? Elena decided she needed to move on and find out what role the children's father might have played in the story and how it was all connected to the fire. Tom, Elena spoke with firmness in her voice, you said that the fire started too quickly, as if it had been accelerated. Do you think it was arson? Tom looked at her with a long look and sighed heavily. I can't say for sure, but, yes, I had that suspicion. We found traces of gasoline in the basement, but the case was quickly closed. Too quickly, to be honest. It's like someone upstairs didn't want us digging any deeper. Those words added more questions to her already crowded head. Who would want to hide the truth about the fire? And what did it have to do with Margaret's disappearance and Mark's debts? You mentioned that the case was closed quickly. Could someone powerful have been involved? She asked, not taking her eyes off Tom. I didn't say that, he answered sharply, lowering his voice. but there are those in our town who are used to dealing with things in less than honorable ways. Have you heard of Connor Stivers? He was a man who always found himself at the center of suspicious cases, but got away with it. The name sounded familiar to Elena. She remembered stories about a businessman who was often involved in shady deals involving investments and real estate. Yes, I've heard that, she answered quietly. Do you think he might have been involved in the fire? Tom just shrugged, neither saying yes nor no, but something like a warning flashed in his eyes. Elena realized that her investigation was taking a dangerous turn. She needed to proceed carefully, but still decisively. She thanked Tom for his help and promised to keep him informed if anything came to light. That evening, after the children were asleep, Helena sat in the kitchen leafing through old newspapers, trying to find anything that might connect Connor Stivers to the fire or Mark's family. She came across a mention of their house in one of the articles. A few years ago it had been the subject of a dispute between two real estate developers, one of whom was connected to Stivers' business. Helena felt that this man might be the key to the whole mystery. The next day, she went to Mrs. Hart's house, hoping to find out if she had met Stivers in the neighborhood before the fire. Connor Stivers? Mrs. Hart interjected, squinting her eyes. Oh, dear, that man always struck me as a snake who only crawled out when he smelled money. Yes, he was seen here several times. He came to see Mark the week before the fire, and their conversation was obviously tense. Helena thanked Mrs. Hart and, feeling her head spinning from the influx of information, headed home. She knew she had a conversation ahead of her with someone who could confirm or deny her hunches, even if it was dangerous. Elena couldn't get rid of the thought of the man she'd seen outside her house. Now that she'd learned more about Mark's suspicious relationship with Connor Stivers, the puzzle was starting to come together. But the big question remained: if Mark was really alive, why was he hiding and not trying to help his children? The next day, Elena decided to follow a familiar route that led to an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town, a place where the homeless and those in hiding sometimes gathered. The evening light was thickening as she approached the massive iron gate. The warehouse seemed gloomy and abandoned, but there was tension in the air. She slowly stepped inside, looking around cautiously. Quiet footsteps sounded somewhere behind her, and Elena turned around sharply. In the semi-darkness, she recognized the figure of a man with a tired face and deep wrinkles around his eyes. It was Mark. He looked at her with caution and distrust, but a shadow of recognition flickered in his gaze. "You're here," she whispered, feeling a shiver run through her body. Mark frowned, his eyes darting toward the exit as if he were assessing the possibility of escape. "Why are you here?" His voice was hoarse, as if he hadn't spoken aloud in a long time. "I know what happened," Elena started confidently, but she was torn with tension. "I know you're alive and that your children think you're dead." Mark closed his eyes for a moment and his face contorted in pain. "I couldn't," he began, but his voice shook. "I couldn't go back." Elena took a step forward. "Why? Why did you leave them?" "Mark, they were suffering. They live in fear and don't know you're alive." The man lowered his head, not daring to meet her gaze. "It wasn't that simple. After the fire, I thought I'd save them, get away to keep us all safe. But things got out of hand. Stivers had me working for him, threatening the kids. I couldn't risk their lives." Elena felt anger mixed with sympathy. She stepped closer and saw Mark clench his fists, his shoulders shaking. "You need to turn yourself in, Mark," she said softer than she intended. "It's the only way to save them and end this situation." Mark looked up, eyes full of despair and doubt. What would happen to them? To Mark and Sophie? Helena noticed Mark's face contorted with pain and inner struggle. He clearly wanted to protect his children, but fear and shame held him back. "If you turn yourself in and cooperate with the police, I promise I'll do everything I can to help them," Elena continued. "They need a safe place and I'm willing to provide it." Mark closed his eyes, breathing heavily. Elena could see his lips quivering and his hands clenched into fists, as if he were struggling with himself. "You don't understand," he whispered. They won't stop. Even if I surrender, Stivers's men will find them. I've tried to pay them off, tried to disappear, but it's no use. They control everything, the police and the courts. Elena sighed, realizing Mark was desperate. His fear was real, but she also knew that the children could not be allowed to continue to live in fear and danger. Then let's start with step 1, she said firmly. Let's find a way to get the kids out of harm's way while you cooperate with the police. It's our only chance. Mark looked at her with pain and gratitude in his eyes that he couldn't hide. I'll do it, but I have conditions, he said slowly. You have to promise that you won't leave them, that you'll be there for them until I can be with them again. Elena leaned forward and put her hand on his shoulder. I promise, she said quietly. But to do that, we have to act now. Where are the children safe now? Mark hesitated, frowning. There's an old house outside of town, he said. It belonged to my aunt, and she died a long time ago, and it's been forgotten. No one would look for them there. Elena nodded. It was a chance. Tomorrow morning we'll start, she said firmly. I'll go to the police and arrange for your appearance. We have to prepare everything so that the children are out of danger. Mark looked at her for a long moment and then, jaw clenched, gave a short nod. Elena spent the entire night sleepless, mentally replaying the plan of action. In the morning, as the first rays of sunlight touched the windows of her house, she approached Mark, who didn't move away from the sleeping children. He watched them with such longing and love that Helena's eyes watered. It's time, she said, hiding the anxiety in her voice. We have to act. Mark glanced at her, then leaned over Sophie and Mark, whispering softly, I'll be back. The morning was cold and gray, as if foreshadowing the difficult trials that lay ahead. Elena and Mark woke the children carefully, trying not to frighten them. Sophie woke up first, rubbing her eyes and looking around in surprise. Mark Jr., sensing his father's presence, froze and opened his eyes wide. Dad, his voice sounded quiet, as if he couldn't believe his eyes. Mark Sr. knelt down in front of his son, and in his gaze he could see all the pain and remorse for the lost months. He wrapped his arms around the children, holding them tightly against him, and Sophie clutched his chest, clenching her fingers into fists. I'm sorry, he whispered, unable to hold back the tears. I thought I was protecting you, but I did it wrong. Elena turned away from the touching scene and went to the window. She had to hurry, for there was little time left. She knew that Stiver's men could act quickly if they learned of Mark's plans. We have to go, she said, turning back to them. The house outside of town is our chance. Mark stood up, carefully holding Sophie's hand. He looked back at Helena with a gratitude that was hard to put into words. Thank you for not leaving them, he said. I know how much it means to you. Elena nodded briefly. Now everything depended on how fast they could act. The road to the old house was long and anxious. Elena drove the car along the deserted road, never taking her eyes off the rearview mirror to make sure there were no pursuers behind them. Mark sat beside her, holding the children and soothing them in a soft voice. Sophie, covered in a warm blanket, was gradually dozing off, and Mark Jr. kept his eyes on the road, as if afraid that any sound would disrupt their journey. We're almost there, Elena said when the familiar shape of an old house with peeling paint and broken shutters appeared ahead. Mark's aunt had once lived here, and the house hadn't seen visitors in a long time. They pulled over and everyone got out of the car. The house looked abandoned, but a safe haven. We're going to stay here for a while, Mark explained to the children, trying to make his voice sound confident. You will be safe here. Helena helped the children inside and they began to tidy up the house as best they could. She noticed Mark standing by the window, holding an old photograph of his family. In that moment he seemed both strong and broken at the same time. You have to trust me and the police, she reminded him. The sooner we get this done, the sooner the children will be safe. Mark nodded silently, continuing to stare at the photograph. I trust, he said. But I can't stop being afraid for them. Elena couldn't shake the feeling of unease that was growing by the hour. The house on the outskirts seemed a safe enough place, but she realized it was too risky to stay here for long. She had contacted one of her contacts in the police force to arrange for Mark's safe transfer, but knew in her heart that not everyone could be trusted. In the evening, as the sun was setting over the horizon, an old car pulled up to the house. Helena recognized it. It was Detective Richardson, who used to work on corruption cases and was known for his toughness. She went to the door, checking that Mark and the kids were staying in a room on the second floor, and opened it. "Elena," the detective pronounced, taking off his hat. His eyes slid around the house as if he was looking for something. "We've received information that persons connected with the fire and fraud case are hiding here." "That's right," she replied cautiously. "Mark is ready to turn himself in, but I need to know that the kids will be safe." Richardson squinted and took a step forward. "Of course they'll be safe. But first I need to look around the house." Elena felt her hands begin to tremble. Something wasn't right. The detective looked overly confident, and there was something threatening in his gaze. "Is this necessary? The children are scared and we have to proceed with caution," she tried to dissuade him. Richardson's tone changed abruptly, his face contorted into a smirk. "You're too trusting, Helena," he said coldly. "You think I'm here to protect them? Stivers doesn't leave things half done." Elena recoiled, her heart racing. She realized the detective was part of a criminal network. She barely had time to think of anything before Richardson pulled out his gun and pointed it at her. "Get Mark. Otherwise the consequences won't be pleasant for anyone." At that moment Mark came out onto the landing, holding Sophie in his arms. He saw what was happening and knew there was no time to think. Without saying a word, he threw a glance at Helena, silently signaling that he needed to act now. "Dad, what's going on?" Mark Jr. whispered, peering around the corner. "Run to the back door," Elena shouted, lunging at the detective. Richardson hadn't expected this and staggered as Elena pushed him. The gun went off, but the bullet went into the ceiling. Mark grabbed the kids and ran toward the back exit, while Elena tried to hold on to the detective, who was struggling to break free. "Run," she shouted, feeling the pain of Richardson's blow echo through her body. Mark sprinted out into the yard with the children and noticed that there was another car nearby with people waiting for a signal. Mark realized there was no time left and he had to act fast. Clutching Sophie in his arms and holding onto Mark Jr.'s hand, he rushed to the back of the yard, where there were thick bushes and an old fence with rusted boards. The noise and shouting from the house grew louder and louder, and Mark knew they had to get away before it was too late. Helena continued to struggle with Richardson, realizing that the forces were unequal. The detective was taller and stronger, and with each passing moment her chances were dwindling. However, when she heard the kids and Mark making their way out through the backyard, hope flared in her soul. "You're going to regret this," Richardson hissed, lashing out sharply and pointing his weapon at Helena. But at that moment the sound of sirens came from behind. Police cars with their blinkers on were approaching the house. Richardson turned pale, his eyes darted toward the exit, and he realized that the situation had not changed in his favor. Without wasting time, he rushed to the window, smashed it and jumped out, hiding in the shadows as the arriving police entered the house. "Here!" Elena shouted, pointing to the broken window, but it was too late, the detective was gone. Police officers rushed inside, checking the rooms and trying to assess the situation. One of the officers ran up to Elena. "Are you all right? We got a report of an assault." "The children. Mark and the kids are in danger," she breathed out, still feeling the pain in her side. "They ran to the back exit. We need to find them now and get them to safety." The officers, realizing the urgency, rushed in that direction. Elena, out of breath, hurried after them, praying that they would find Mark and the children before Stivers' men could get to them. As Mark made his way through the thicket, he heard the sound of cars and voices. He stopped for a moment, cradling the children against him and trying to breathe as quietly as possible. His heart was pounding so loudly in his chest that he thought it could be heard within a few meters. Mark Jr. clung to his father, holding back tears. "Daddy, what's going on?" he whispered. "It's going to be okay, son," Mark whispered, trying to sound confident. "We're going to get out of here, I promise." At that moment he noticed the beams of flashlights and heard the voices of the police. He stood up, pulling the children closer, and headed toward the light. "Here!" he shouted, emerging from the bushes with Sophie in his arms. The officers saw them and ran up, covering the children with their bodies. Elena, seeing them, felt a huge weight lifted off her chest. She ran over to them, hugging Mark and the children, and felt tears of joy and relief flow down her cheeks. The car sped down the winding mountain road, barely illuminated by the faint light of the headlights. Elena held the steering wheel with both hands, staring intently into the darkness. Mark sat beside her, glancing occasionally at the children, who slept in the back seat, tired from the excitement. Sophie and Mark, Jr. were snuggled up against each other, sleeping quietly, wrapped in blankets. "We're getting close," Mark said quietly, pointing to a small exit leading to an old log cabin that had once belonged to his family. "They won't find us there." Elena nodded, steering the car onto the narrow trail. The road became more and more difficult, and the trees seemed to close in above them in a dense wall. Finally, after a few minutes, a small wooden house with a chimney and an abandoned porch showed up in the headlights. "We'll be safe here," Mark added, looking at the house with sadness and hope. They quickly got out of the car. Helena took the sleeping Sophie in her arms and Mark helped his son out, then they headed towards the house. It was cold inside, but dry and cozy. The old wooden beams creaked under their footsteps, and the cobwebs and dust reminded them that this place hadn't seen people in a long time. "We need to make a fireplace," Mark said, peering into the dark corners of the room. The children were freezing. Elena nodded and started looking for matches and wood. After a few minutes, the fireplace blazed, illuminating the room with a soft glow. The children began to wake up, looking around in surprise. "Where are we?" Mark Jr. asked, wiping his eyes. "This is a place where we can rest for a while," Elena explained, trying to smile. "We're safe here." At that moment, footsteps were heard on the porch. Helena's heart clenched, and Mark rushed to the door to peek through the crack. Standing outside the door was a woman with tear-stained eyes and disheveled hair. He swung the door open, unable to believe his eyes. "Margaret?" His voice trembled with excitement. The woman who had seemed like a ghost before stepped inside, wrapping her arms around Mark. Her eyes met those of the children, and the tears flowed again. "Mommy?" Sophie whispered, unable to believe what she was seeing. Margaret fell to her knees, hugging the children and Mark, unable to hold back her sobs. The room was filled with silence, broken only by the sounds of crying. Helena stood aside, not daring to interfere with this touching scene. She watched as Margaret, trembling with emotion, cradled her children in her arms. Sophie wrapped her little arms around her neck, and Mark Jr. held her mother's hand tightly, as if afraid she would disappear again. "I've missed you so much, my babies," Margaret whispered, stroking Sophie's hair. "I'm sorry I had to leave. I didn't mean for this to happen." Mark Sr. sat down beside her, hugging them all at once. His face was full of pain and relief at the same time. "I thought I'd lost you," he said, his voice breaking with emotion. "Where have you been all these months?" Margaret raised her eyes to her husband, then to Helena. She sighed, as if gathering strength for her story. "I had to hide," she began. "After that fire, it was a miracle I got out of the house. Stivers's men were there, looking for me, trying to silence me. I knew that if they knew I was alive, they'd find the children and do whatever they could to silence us." Elena felt a chill run down her spine. Margaret's story had been horrible, but a lot of things had fallen into place. "I tried to go back, but every time someone followed me," Margaret continued, her hands clenching into fists. "I took refuge with an old friend who hid me in the mountains. All this time all I could think about was you, how to get you back, but I didn't know where you were or how to get to you undetected. Mark hugged her tighter. "You're with us now, and we'll find a way out together," he said firmly. Elena stepped closer, deciding it was time to ask the big question. "Margaret, we need to know everything to end this threat. You mentioned Stivers. Is he still looking for you?" The woman nodded, her face pale. "Yes. He won't stop until he's sure no one can tell his business. But I have something that might make a difference." Her voice trembled and she looked at Mark. "Evidence of his machinations. I've been hiding them all this time." Elena felt a surge of hope. "Then we have a chance," she said. "We can use this evidence to keep you safe and bring him to justice." Margaret's gaze softened, and she smiled, for the first time in a long time. "Then we must act quickly." Helena and Mark, with the children and Margaret, spent the night in the old house, discussing a plan of action. The room was lit only by the dim light from the fireplace, and their faces seemed like shadows reflecting tension and determination. Margaret uncovered the hidden documents, an old folder of papers and a digital drive. She revealed that these materials contained detailed schematics of Stivers' machinations, including transactions that could prove his guilt. "These documents are our key to salvation," Margaret said, handing the folder to Mark. "They show how he used shell companies and bribed officials." Elena, holding the drive in her hands, felt a cold sweat break out on her forehead. She knew that once they gave this information to the police, there would be no turning back. "We have to contact Captain Lewis," she said. "He's one of the few people on the force we can trust. He's been trying to expose Stivers for a long time." Mark nodded, looking at his wife and kids. "We'll do it together. But we have to be ready for any eventuality." At that moment, something creaked outside the window. Elena was wary and went to the window, cautiously looking out. A shadow flashed in the darkness, and she realized that they had been found. Her heart began to pound at breakneck speed. "We're not alone," she whispered, turning to the others. "They're here." Mark quickly hid the folder, and Margaret clutched the children tighter to her, trying not to show fear. Helena ran to the door and slid the old deadbolt shut, hoping it would delay the unwelcome guests at least a little. Suddenly the silence was broken by a loud bang on the door, and it shook under the onslaught. Mark rushed to the window and spotted several men with flashlights and guns. They were Stivers' men. He realized there was no time to think. "Stay away from the windows," he ordered, looking at Helena and Margaret. "Elena, do you have a phone? Call Captain Lewis." Elena frantically pulled out her phone and dialed the number. Lewis's voice came through after a few beeps. "Lewis here. Captain, we need your help urgently. We're in an old house in the mountains. Stivers' men found us," she said quickly, trying not to panic. "Hang on," Lewis replied. "We're on our way." Meanwhile, the door cracked open and one of Stivers' men burst inside. Mark did not hesitate to rush at his attacker, trying to push him back and buy time. The fight was fierce, blows and the noise of falls filling the room. Helena stepped back, clutching the phone to her chest and trying to shield Margaret and the children. "Mark, hold on!" she shouted, watching as he grappled with one of the bandits. The rest of Stivers' men began to rush in, crowding around the door. Elena quickly assessed the situation and realized that if the police didn't get there in time, the chances of getting out would be minimal. She looked around and noticed an old gun rack in the corner of the room. With fear and trembling in her hands, she grabbed the weapon and pointed it at the door. "Leave or you'll regret it," she shouted, trying to keep her voice from shaking. One of the attackers froze when he heard the threat, but the other only laughed and took a step forward. At that moment, sirens sounded. The police were closing in. Stivers obviously did not expect such a quick reaction, and panic began to spread among his men. One of the perpetrators shouted, "We've been found. Let's go." But not everyone was ready to give up so easily. One of the attackers, a tall man with cold eyes, pointed a gun at Margaret and the children. At that moment Mark, already wounded, rushed forward and knocked him down, holding him on the floor. "Daddy!" screamed Mark Jr., his voice shaking with fear. Police officers burst through the door, shouting commands. The villains began to retreat, but some were still trying to fight back. Captain Lewis and his SWAT team entered the house and quickly assessed the situation. "Guns on the ground!" he shouted, pointing his assault rifle at the attackers. Helena, feeling the tension leave her, slowly lowered the gun and backed away from Margaret and the children. Sophie wrapped her arms around her leg, trembling with fear, and Mark Jr. huddled against his mother, watching the scene with wide-eyed wonderment. A few minutes later, all the criminals were disarmed and disarmed. Captain Lewis walked over to Elena and Mark, looking at them with respect. "You did it," he said, putting his hand on Mark's shoulder. "We'll take them all away and start the investigation. Your evidence will now be key." Mark looked at his wife and children, his gaze full of relief and pride. He realized that this was the moment to accept responsibility. "Captain, I'm willing to turn myself in and testify to protect my family," he said firmly. Lewis nodded, respecting his choice. It was the right decision. Mark took a step forward and gripped Margaret's hand tighter, who looked at him with a mixture of pain and understanding. The children, still trembling with fear, clung to their mother, not fully understanding what was happening, but sensing that something important was being decided. "Daddy, you won't leave again, will you?" Mark Jr. whispered, his eyes filling with tears. Mark knelt down in front of his son, holding back his emotions. He wanted to look strong so the children wouldn't see how hard it was for him. "I'll be back, I promise," he said, hugging the boy and Sophie. "But right now it's the only way to protect you all. I have to do this so you can live in peace." Elena, who had been watching this scene, felt her chest tighten. She knew that at this moment Mark was acting like a true father and husband, willing to sacrifice himself for his family. She turned to Captain Lewis. "Please make sure he's going to be okay," she said, hoping her words would resonate. Lewis nodded, his face serious, but there was a spark of understanding in his eyes. "We'll make sure Mark gets fair treatment. He'll be a key witness against Stivers and his men. Your evidence will help this case." The police officers led the detainees out of the house, and the captain escorted Mark to the patrol car. He looked around once more to see the faces of his family. Margaret was standing with the children and Helena, hugging them tightly as if to protect them from harm. "We'll be waiting for you," she whispered, her eyes glistening with tears. Mark nodded, getting into the car, and with a quiet creak of the doors, the car started up. Helena put her arm around Margaret's shoulders, feeling her own eyes fill with tears. "It's going to be okay," she said, trying to put confidence into her words. "Now we have a chance to start over." The children, clinging to their mother, watched the car drive away until its lights disappeared around the corner. A night that began with terror and fear ended with a new beginning, a moment and the family, despite the separation, found a way to escape and hope for a better future. Hours later, as the house fell back into silence, Helena sat next to Margaret, watching the children fall asleep in the chairs by the fireplace. The flames of the fire slowly died out, and the peace in the room seemed fragile and precious. "Thank you, Helena," Margaret whispered, squeezing her hand. "We couldn't have done it without you." Helena smiled weakly and nodded, feeling that despite all the difficulties, they had done the right thing. The trial began several months after the events of that fateful night. In that time, Elena and Margaret had done everything they could to provide their children with stability and peace of mind. The house in which they were hiding became their temporary refuge, but soon they moved to a small cozy house near the city center. Sophie and Mark Jr. began attending the local school, making new acquaintances and slowly regaining the joy of childhood. The atmosphere in the courtroom was tense. Mark sat in the dock, dressed in an austere suit, but his face was calm and determined. Next to him sat his lawyer, and across from him sat Captain Lewis, who was to confirm that Mark had helped expose a whole network of criminal machinations headed by Stivers. The entire family, including Elena, sat in the front rows, cheering him on. The judge, a man with gray hair and a stern look, announced the beginning of the hearing. "Today we will hear the case of Mark Reese, accused of complicity in financial fraud and cover-up, and his cooperation with the authorities leading to the arrest of Connor Stivers and his associates, the judge said, rolling his eyes around the room. The testimony provided by Mark, as well as the documents found by Margaret and turned over by Elena, formed the basis of the charges against Stivers. The prosecution asked for a substantial sentence for Mark, but the defense attorney pushed for a reduced sentence for his active cooperation and desire to protect his family. As the judge moved to announce the sentence, the silence in the room became almost palpable. In view of all the circumstances and your full cooperation with the authorities, the court sentences you to 3 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after 2 years, the judge said, banging his gavel. Margaret covered her face with her hands, holding back tears. Helena put a hand on her shoulder, trying to give her strength. Mark turned to them, his eyes full of relief and hope. "We'll make it," Mark whispered, looking at his family who sat in the front rows. His gaze was filled with determination and hope. He knew he had difficult years ahead of him, but he also realized that this path was the only right one. When the court session ended and the hall began to empty, Margaret, hugging her children, approached Mark. The policeman who had accompanied him took a step back, allowing the family to say goodbye. "We'll wait for you every day," Margaret said, trying to keep her emotions in check, but her voice trembled. Sophie, putting her arms around her father's waist, said quietly, "Daddy, come back soon." Mark leaned over to hug her, then squeezed Mark Jr.'s hand tightly. He looked back at Elena and added quietly, "Thank you for everything. You've been a lifesaver for us." Elena nodded, her eyes full of tears that she was trying hard to hold back. "We'll take care of them until you come back," she replied confidently. The policeman signaled and Mark stepped forward, preparing himself for the ordeal ahead. The last glimpse of his family remained in his mind as he left the courtroom. Several months passed and the family's life began to get better. Margaret and Helen joined forces to create a new home for the children, full of warmth and love. The house they settled in was small but cozy. Its windows overlooked a sun-drenched meadow, and the yard was filled with the laughter of the children as they played together. Helen became not only a friend, but also a support for Margaret, with whom it was easier to cope with everyday cares and worries. They spent evenings together, discussing plans for the future and sharing memories. The children, despite the absence of their father, were cozy in this new home, where there was an atmosphere of love and support. "What do you think Mark is doing now?" Sophie asked one evening, sitting at the table with her mother and Elena. "He's thinking about us and waiting to come home," Margaret replied with a smile, stroking her daughter's head. Looking at the smiling children, Elena realized that despite everything they had been through, they had managed to keep the most important thing, family. 2.5 years later, on a clear spring day, Mark came out of the prison gates with a small backpack in his hands and a smile he couldn't hide. His eyes, used to the monotonous sight of gray walls, finally met the green forest and blue sky he had been waiting for so long. But most importantly, his family stood in front: Margaret, Sophie, Mark Jr., and Helena, who had become part of their family during this time. "Daddy!" Sophie shouted, running toward him, waving her arms. Mark Jr. rushed after her as well, his footsteps full of impatience. Mark put down his backpack and hugged his children tightly, feeling tears of happiness come to his eyes. Margaret approached slowly, her face glowing with the joy and relief they had waited so long for. She hugged her husband, and he pressed himself against her shoulder, feeling the warmth of her arms bring him home. "We've been waiting for you," she whispered, not letting go of him. "I knew you'd be waiting, and it kept me going," Mark replied, squeezing her hand tightly. Helena stood a little further away, watching this touching scene. She smiled as Mark looked at her with gratitude. "You've always been there for me, Elena." "Thank you for everything," he said as he walked over and hugged her. "We made it through together," she replied, feeling relief finally fill her heart. The return home was filled with laughter and conversation. Margaret and Helen had prepared a cozy dinner in advance, and the house was filled with the aromas of fresh bread and roasted meat. The children never left Mark's side, talking about their successes at school, their friends, and their adventures with their mother and Helen. We've been through so much, but now we're starting a new time, Mark said, holding Sophie in his arms and looking at his smiling son. This is our chance to live again. Margaret, pouring hot tea for everyone, added. We've been through hardship, but it's made us stronger. We are together again, and now nothing can separate us. The atmosphere at the table was warm and filled with stories and memories. Late in the evening, when the children were already asleep, the adults gathered on the veranda, where a light breeze brought the smell of spring flowers. The moon illuminated their faces with its soft light, and for a moment everything seemed peaceful and complete. You know, when I was in prison, I had plenty of time to realize everything that had happened, Mark began, looking at Margaret and Helena. I thought about you every day and realized how grateful I was to have a family like this. Margaret squeezed his hand, her eyes glistening with tears. We've been doing a lot of thinking, too, she said. Memories of those days when all seemed lost reminded us that the important thing was to stick together. It was hard without you, but Elena helped us, and we were able to cope. Elena smiled and sighed. We've all been through this together, she replied. And I'm happy we're here, alive and well, together. They fell silent, enjoying the sounds of the night and each other's presence. It seemed that all the trials were far behind them, and there was only a road ahead, full of light and joy. What's next? Margaret asked with a smile, looking at Mark. What are your plans for the future? Mark thought for a moment, then answered confidently. To build a life that our children will remember with a smile. I want to be around to see them grow up and enjoy every moment. And also to continue to help other families who are facing difficulties so they know there is a way out. Elena, hearing this, nodded. That's a wonderful idea. Our experience can help a lot of people. Silence came over them again, but this time it was not a disturbing silence, but a quiet, peaceful moment of understanding and harmony. Life had given them a second chance, and they were going to make the most of it. The night passed, and the first ray of the morning sun illuminated the house where peace and happiness finally reigned. Thank you for walking this journey with the characters in this story. I hope this story about the power of family, forgiveness, and new beginnings has inspired you and reminded you of the importance of support and love even in the most difficult times. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to leave your impressions and comments. Your thoughts and feedback are very important and inspire new stories. Subscribe and give us a like so we don't miss new stories. I apologize for any errors in the text. Thank you for your understanding and support.